Committee meeting to order. Roll call, Denise.
Mrs. Mutter,
Here.
Dr. Price,
Here.
Stevens,
Yes.
Dr. Bryan,
Here.
Ryan Lee,
Here.
Justina Johnson, Ryan Trower,
Here.
Thomas Mason, Laura Clem, Suzette Jaski,
Here.
Megan is excused, Sophia Vargas,
Here.
and Rhonda Lopez.
Here.
Okay, thank you. You have a copy of the minutes, or you received a copy of the minutes? Oh, no, they're in your packet. So if you'd look that over and see if there's any corrections or additions. Okay, hearing none, and that brings us to the Tarek.
Hello, good evening. So we're calling a little audible here from some of the recent actions that just happened yesterday. So if you notice, I'm going to call your attention to what's in your board packet. So you know we have deadlines when we need to publish these things. So when we wrote this a couple days ago, we thought there was going to be a deal at the state level on releasing some of the surplus funding. Yesterday, that all changed, so that was shot down, so there is no deal. So I'm just going to point out a couple things in here and show you what changed and what could have been. So there was a deal between the governor and some of the legislators, but it just didn't pass both sides of the legislation that it needed to last night. So there was a deal that would have raised the special ed reimbursement aid rate up to 50% for next year, 2026-27, which is what the budget that we're planning on, and actually would have increased the allocation for this year as well, 2025-26, up to estimated 42.7%. This year's budget had a some certain amount in the allocation. So remember last committee we talked about the difference between some certain and some sufficient. Some certain means it's a static budget line. So they come up with a number of what they think is going to be adequate to achieve a certain percentage, but then we know from our history that they always got that number wrong, so that the claims that came in were exceeded what they thought they would be, and we ended up getting prorated. So even though this year's state budget says we should be getting 42%, we budgeted for 39%. And now it looks like we'll be lucky if we get 39% this year. But the deal was supposed to make that part fully funded and then a little bit more at 42.7 and then increase next year to 50. So not the 60% that we'd hoped for, but still significant increase. The other part of the state budget had to do with property tax relief. So still welcomed in our area, especially after we saw the increases that we did this year, primarily due to the loss of state aid that we got. But the additional funding, the other $300 million in this deal, would have come in the form of, it looked like a per pupil amount, but still under revenue limit. So that's why it would have been property tax relief. Not spendable dollars to us. It would not have increased our revenue limit at all, but it would have increased the general aid to our district, which in turn would have had the opposite effect of reducing property taxes. So that deal is gone now. So now we have to talk about what's next. So in here, we had updated some things anticipating that deal. We need to change those now, and we're going to do it on the fly here. So the deficit range was anywhere from 6.3 million at this time when we published this, before considering any salary increases, and then up to 13.2 once you take into account salary schedule movements, and then in this scenario, the maximum CPI of 2.63%. That's also known as cost of living adjustments. That, of course, has to be negotiated with our one remaining represented group, but also that is a factor that we just can plug in any numbers that we know what the value of 1% will be. So that's just a hypothetical scenario. So now we also want to address the current economic situation, our climate, our property tax increase history in the community, and the discussion around referendum is always up. And that's what we're looking to get some discussion going here as well. But the referendum process is a lengthy process. So we're outlining some of the things that would need to happen before you can just throw a question on a ballot. First, you'd have to pretty much identify the plan B, if you will. What happens if the referendum does not pass, or if you don't have a referendum question? So we have to try to think of how are we going to balance the budget after we look at where our position is going to be. If you're talking about a referendum, we're going to be looking for some kind of community feedback, surveying for the board. The board itself would have to come to consensus on the type of operating referendum that they would wish to pursue. And that could be either be a recurring, which is like a permanent referendum, or a non-recurring, which has a specific duration, so it ends. And that could be any duration. It could be 1 year, could be 5, could be 10, just however you write the question. And then, of course, would be the consensus that the board would have to come to on the amount of the operating referendum. That amount can vary because costs today are not going to be the same costs 2 years from now, 3 years from now, or even the next year. So you have to consider things. Do you ask for consistent amounts, or do you include inflationary escalators? All that discussion would have to happen. And then there's the communications and community engagement plan. So, that could be anything that's up to the board, but it could be anything from listening sessions, town hall meetings, all the normal things that you would do to gather input before deciding to put out a question like that. Our recommendation, though, would be that before considering putting a question on a referendum, we would advise the board to kind of pre-approve cuts that would have to happen if their referendum either failed or we don't go to a referendum, because we are in a odd timeline here. So we're talking about planning for 26-27 fiscal year. Honestly, a lot of the deadlines that we have to meet to make or affect any kind of changes on staffing for 26-27 have come and gone. So realistically, when we're talking about cuts or even referendum, really what we're going to be able to affect is the 27-28 fiscal year, which is 2 years from now. So let's just take a look what was published in the packet. We had I left this original, remember we were talking about if the state would give us 3% state aid on the special ed reimbursement increase, that would have translated into about $1.3 million. We replaced that with the hopeful deal that it was supposed to get up to 49% or 50%. That would have gave us $4.3 million. We're going to just change that now. So I'm going to take you now to the live sheet and just do this on the fly here. So no more 4.3, and I can't turn this one back on. Why? Because this would be assuming a 3% increase. Absent of a deal from the state, that allocation for special ed aid reimbursement stays the same in the state budget for next year. And we know from our experience, school districts are not going to claim less, they're going to claim more for special ed costs because most of the costs are tied to staff. So the staff didn't get any less expensive. All the health insurance costs didn't get less expensive. Transportation costs didn't get less expensive. So we know that special ed costs that are going to be claimed will increase. which is going to increase the pressure on that allocation amount. So we expect a proration to be even further. So we will be lucky if we see 39 this year, which is what we budgeted for. And we'll be lucky if, I'm guessing now, it might even be like 37, 36 next year. But for the purpose of this scenario, let's just assume we can get 39 this year and 39 next year. This one's gone, so now we are looking at revenue increase of less than 1.8 million. That's after factoring in our 500 students less that we're anticipating for next year. So we're looking at change in budget. This isn't the total budget, this is the change in, because we look at one fiscal year to the next. So we anticipate $1.8 million more in revenue, so money to spend. But then here's all the list of just what's going to increase or decrease. This line right here, the structural deficit, this is from our adopted budget this year, 25-26. If you go back and look at the budget that the board adopted back in October, the end of October, you'll see that the revenues are short of the expenses by $3 million. That's what we call a structural deficit. Now, there's a difference between budget to actual. By the time we get to the end of the fiscal year, we're hoping that everything that was budgeted for, we know that it will not be spent. Most of that's going to be related to position vacancies. So when we have a position that we authorize to fill, we don't always find the right candidates, don't always find candidates, period. And sometimes those positions go unfilled. And then if they're classroom positions, we'll end up substituting those positions. So there's a cost difference to what we budgeted and to what we actually end up spending for the year. We call that budget to actual variance. But on paper, you see that the structural difference is $3 million. Curriculum adoption already happened, so we dedicated $1.5 million for some overdue curriculum needs. So these are part of the budget already. Our transportation contract expired and we went out to bid for that, and this is our best guess of what's come back for that right now. This is still to be determined and finalized, but we're anticipating about almost 20% increase in that first year on our transportation contract rates. Health insurance premium increases, 9.9%. That was the cap number that we received from United Healthcare this year. And that is, I stress the word cap because without the cap, we're looking at in the mid-20s for a percent increase. Dental insurance, smaller number, but 6% increase. And these two items are right now are unchecked, but we can check them and show you what the scenario is. But these total up to just under $7 million. And these are what we call the salary-related pieces. So salary schedule movements, that's just simply honoring the salary schedule. So allowing people movement used to be known as steps. Now they're levels on our salary schedules. So that's year of service, you move. That equates to about 1.4% of salaries. So that's where we get this $2.4 million number. And this is for all full-time equivalent groups. Consumer price index, right now the number is set at a maximum of 2.63%. So like I mentioned, that it will be a negotiated item, so it can be anywhere from 0 to 2.63, but 2.63 is the ceiling. It's about $4.5 million. These are relatively small pieces, but liability, property insurance, those are going up. These you see pluses and minuses. So these are identified staffing changes through the staffing process that already happened. So these are anywhere from some reductions that were identified to additions. Most of the additions are going to be related to achieving the added prep time goal and special ed. So we saw a big increase in our incoming special ed kindergartner needs, so we have no choice but to add staff there. The net effect of all those, these are smaller items, but technology refresh, if you notice, we don't include the full technology refresh, which was over $1 million, but we have some some bare minimum needs that we need to refresh on our teachers' technology. So that's about $250,000 there. The removal of map assessments, small dollar amount, and then there's this line item which we can turn on or off now, but this was to reduce the premium increase of 9.9% on our active employees. The United Healthcare gave an option of separating out the retiree insurance underwriting, which would have saved 1.4% on the active operating funds. And that equates to about $566,000, so a little over $500,000 on that line item. All in all, if you add up all these things that are checked, here's our problem. That's $12.3 million of added expenses and only $1.7 million of added revenue. That is furthering the structural deficit. So that's saying we're budgeting for more things than we can afford in this fiscal year, and to the tune of $10.5 million. Yep. So Dr. Weiss is asking what happens if we checked the salaries. So if we check the salaries on, now we're talking about $17.5 million. On the revenue side, nothing is really going to change. This is pretty much what we're dealing with. The board really has control on the expense side. The revenue side kind of is what it is. And this item, right now, the board did pass this at the last board meeting, but it's also up on the next topic at the special board meeting. So this one can go on or off. Right now, technically, this is in play, that reduction. So 16.9 with salary increases, and then just over $10 million without.
For the salary increases, are those like all in or all out, or are the, like, I guess the different types of headcount, some could get a CPI adjustment, others couldn't?
Yeah, for this purpose right now in here, it's all our full-time equivalent employees, so all the groups. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's the way it's in this scenario. And that's the way it's been traditionally. It's been pretty much the same percentage. One group is negotiated, but then it's been a follow suit kind of a thing.
So if I'm understanding correctly, it's not performance-based?
No, nothing tied to performance.
Okay. How do we fund the deficit?
See, there's two options. Don't do the deficit, cut some more, or you live with a bad year of reserves. That's dangerous unless you have a plan after. It'd be one thing if you make established cuts, and like I said at the beginning, the time frame to make cuts for 2026-27 is already passed on some of the big ticket items. But if you have those cuts in place and you know they're coming up for the next year after that, that's a better scenario to live with one bad year going into your reserves than it is to just have it indefinite and hope for something good to come in 2 years.
So there's no mechanism to take on debt? I'm not saying we want to.
Not for operational debt like that.
Okay.
That's what referenda are. Referenda is going to the public and asking the question to exceed your revenue limit. That's the other alternative to that. But you can't just take on debt like that.
And how much reserves do we have?
So reserves are around 25% of revenue right now.
Okay.
So it's a balancing act, because our operating reserves are not just a rainy day fund. There are operating funds. Because of the way that we take in our revenue from the state and from property tax collections, it's not like July 1, which is the beginning of our fiscal year, comes and we get $235 million sent to our bank account. We get it in chunks, in sporadic chunks.
Yeah. We have a cash flow
Cash flow.
challenge. Yeah.
And it's also, when we do have free cash, we're able to invest to the tune of generating, over $2 million of interest income revenue, which becomes part of our revenue budget. So the more that you spend out of your reserves, the less revenue, the less that becomes a reduced revenue line item than the next year. So it's kind of a double hit on there. So now the question becomes, what's next? It's kind of philosophical, but not really. So we've run into a situation with the state budget, and unfortunately what's happening in Madison, we're caught in the middle. So we're at the mercy of that. So it looks like we're stuck with this budget at least for the next year. And then the budget cycle goes in 2-year cycles. So next year, 26, 27, will be the second part of the state biennial budget. And then the whole process starts again. And our enrollment, unfortunately, we don't see any change in that downward trend on enrollment as well. So it's kind of, that's where we're at.
Is there a way that we could see the trended financials related to these specific line items? Like, I pulled what was online, and so there's certain overall accounts, but then these are specific year-over-year adjustments that don't really tell what's been adjusted previous years versus what's being adjusted this next year, and so it's hard to see like a
Yeah,
3 to 5
they
year
don't
trend.
translate directly to a line item. So our chart of accounts is tens of thousands of accounts. So these are summarized portions of those. So
I guess before we would get into sort of line item evaluation, I would like to hear what the leadership's ideas are. I mean, if you're assuming that, if you have to assume this budget cut, what is your plan? That's sort of my first question.
Thank you. I'd be happy to. And let me give, when I came in about 4 years ago, we were looking at a very similar budget. And one of the first meetings I was at, Mr. Hamden had a presentation where we had to walk through and come up with cuts in order to meet different levels, $5, $10, $15 million worth of cuts at the time, just to see what those items were. Some of those items were closing 2 or 3 schools. Some of those items were making cuts in various employee groups. Just about everything that we looked at then, we've done. We have, we've closed 7 schools. We've made some major cuts to staffing and personnel over the years. We are at a point where we can't cut our way out of this any longer. Looking around the state, there's a couple of districts that were in dire straits. 3 come to mind. Hustisford, Lake Country, and Mauston. Hustisford is closing next year. They're dissolving. They had a referendum, I think it was their 3rd go-round, and it failed, therefore they're dissolving. And the other area, school districts need to assume their debt and their students. Lake Country and Mauston passed on their 3rd attempt and didn't go into dissolution. We are at a point right now where we have to go for an operational referendum. I know the last one failed, and I think there's some lessons we can learn from that. However, one of those is being very clear on what our cuts are going to be up front. That was one of the concerns that I heard from community when I was out doing the listening sessions. I don't think we were specific enough. I wasn't as specific enough on what would happen. That's why we're talking about we need to identify these cuts prior to asking the questions, so people are very clear on what's at stake. Whether that referendum happens in November or April, and we have to follow we have to follow the regular election cycle. So we can't call like a special election to have a referendum. We have to follow what the normal voting patterns are. So that would be November 3rd of 26 or April of 27. Exactly when this happens is something that I would like to get some feedback on. And ultimately, you know, the board will determine when that would occur. But there are certain steps that need to happen. We need to survey the community. We need to identify the cuts. I would like to have the cuts solidified too, going into it. But there's also then the informational campaign and getting out and sharing our story once again. So that's where I see things. I don't, unless there's a significant change to the state funding formula. Right now, I think what we're seeing is districts who pass their referendum questions are being able to, at least, and I'm not going to say they're flourishing, but they're able to maintain services for students. They're able to retain staff by being able to give cost of living adjustments. And districts that don't are really, I'd say, teetering on becoming the have-nots of public education. So that's where I see things, and I know it sounds pretty dire, but I think it is pretty dire.
I heard school leadership, so I think the board here could take some credit for doing a lot of lobbying and advocacy. A couple of us about a year ago went and met with Ned Wesky, DeSmit, Nass, Wirch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in this last week, in a mad scramble, because this was just dropped on Monday, your superintendent, myself, our CFO met with Senator Wirch's office. I was able to advocate to Ned Wesky, Representative Ned Wesky. They dropped the ball. They made a promise to meet this level of funding that we're not getting. We're not anywhere near close. Blame the legislature, your legislature. There's nobody innocent here in terms of Dems or Republicans. There was an imperfect compromise, and that's what it was. And we worked hard to try to get our voice in the mix, and everybody on this board has portrayed, done some type of role, but that's where we're at. So I just want to assure you and anybody that's listening that we haven't been just sitting or waiting. We've been doing every last thing we can, but we have a state legislature which is dysfunctional and is shortchanging kids. That's the reality. So we're going to have to come together as a community and figure out what we want to do. We can't be waiting for 2 years until they get their act together, but we're going to have to do something ourselves and have one message going forward, my opinion. One school board. I know other school board members certainly have been doing advocacy and might be able to speak to that.
Dr. Weiss, you mentioned as far as timing for certain cuts, and I think you need to sort of explain that to the committee members.
Yep, thank you. There are state statutes on when timelines as far as when contracts need to be issued and if there's going to be a non-renewal, when that notification process has to occur. In order to have, right now we're looking at the 27-28 school year to get for any major reductions. There are some cost-saving measures we could take prior to that. Not filling through attrition, some of those ideas that we have out there. But really, we're talking about, when we're looking at impacts, it'll be the 27-28 school year that we're looking for that. So I think I believe that was the question that you were asking.
Yes, are there other questions for either Tarek or Dr. Weiss?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not going to dispute the legislature comment because I agree. And then also the need for probably an increased local levy to increase the funding. Just for those who may not know, like the mill rate, which is the ratio for taxation, is I think at a 20-year low in the last 2 years. So it's not like we're overtaxing or anything. But my question earlier about the sub-line items, as a, like I said, FP&A professional, it's difficult to determine just a year-over-year budget change, like what you're showing here, and the provided sources online. So the distributed budget, I did a 5-year analysis, and like there are a couple areas that I, at minimum, have questions on for the increases that they saw in the 25-26 budget cycle. For example, while admin, supervisory, and tech headcount went down, the admin salaries went up 14% last year. There's this general fund, or this general supplies that went up 2.5 million last year, or 130%. So it's like, it's difficult to determine what's underlying
Yeah.
there.
Let me address that a little
Yeah.
bit. So I respect your professional background, but you do not have the knowledge and the access or the history to do proper analysis on that. So let me, and I've looked at that one specifically to show you kind of, if we can just take a little field trip here on the admin one specifically.
And I totally understand that,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
have the background, that's kind of what I'm asking.
Yeah, I 100% understand your point. But the admin one specifically, and it wasn't just you, I've seen some stuff that's been put out in the community, and this is the kind of stuff that, let's go back to another item that we've had recently, like AI and using ChatGPT. You can get a technically right answer based on the information that is available to the machine language, but it does not have the context, it does not have the history. So let me show you what I'm talking about there, because I've looked at this specific item. So give me 1 second to pull it up here. Bear with me.
And I just want to, I didn't get this from AI, I pulled it from the.
No, I get you. That just tied it to a different piece that I've been seeing some things online, so. I'm going to show you specifically what I'm talking about here. If I can find it. Give me 1 sec. So you got a lot of folders here. When was our last committee meeting?
Well, he's
Yeah.
looking for that. I can at least elaborate. We do spend quite a bit on technology in the district, and from that standpoint, a lot of the vendors and companies are still working to recover what they say they lost or did not make from the COVID pandemic that we had, so a lot of them are still playing catch-up. We are getting renewals for some of our maintenance software that are not 4% increases or 8%, but some that are 300% increases that are causing us to look at other alternatives. And these are critical monitoring systems, cybersecurity, things that we have to, are federally required to have filtering systems. All of our phones, for example, as Dr. Weiss mentioned, we closed several buildings and all of our classrooms had internet-connected phones, so we reduced that number. But our cost of support went up 20%, and that was with securing a multi-year agreement. If we would have been year to year, it would have been closer to 30%. So even from that standpoint, and even our Chromebooks, which are probably one of our biggest components, they used to be about $225. They're getting close to $300 now. And even with the security upgrades, that I know metal detectors were a prominent one recently, but by the amount of cameras that we have that are on our network system that the schools work to monitor. So think of your TVs, you're pulling in one signal. Well, at most of our schools, they'll have the grid up, like 18 cameras live at one time, so you need graphics intensive devices. And so we build those models for the dean's offices to have or others. Those models were 1,400 2 weeks ago, and we just went to place another order and they went up to $2,700. So there are significant increases, and that's just from a technology standpoint, but we're seeing that also from several other areas, whether it's software maintenance or hardware maintenance. And so, again, a lot of these are critical components that we cannot do without. So they, just to add some context from
And
that
just-
side of it.
Yeah, just to add to that, so for example, like diesel fuel, a part of our bus contract has $3 per gallon of diesel worked into it. Anything over that gets passed along to the district. So when diesel hits $6 a gallon, those costs get passed along to the district to pay. And we can't pass along the cost of these, we can't pass along that price to our consumers. We don't charge for it. So all of those things are things that eat at our budget. And
All right. A lot of numbers. I'm going to zoom in. We'll try to do this quick. Wasn't planning on doing this, but this is a good lead-in because I appreciate that sentiment. And it's confusing. And there's a lot of consolidated records. But here's, I believe what you're looking at is the expenses by object in our general fund is probably what you were looking at on our published data. So we have the budget for 25-26, which is our current year budget. Then we have 3 years prior actuals. So if you look at object 2113, so we have two different things going on. We have what's called the DPI Wolfer codes, which is the uniform accounting standard codes that we use. And then we have internal departmental classifications. So for teacher pay, this is the history that we see. So from 2023, 24, 25, 26, here's the change in spend and then budget. So you see we had an increase, 3.74, we had a decrease, then we had an increase. Now that encompasses all in, this is just salary, so changes in headcount and then changes in salary, so consumer price index, that salary schedule movements, all of that, this is a net number. This is the number I believe you saw. So if you strictly look at 2110, which is labeled administrator pay, this is the history that you see, 9.8, 10.2, 9.5, and then a spike up to 10.9. So that's what you're seeing as a 14% increase. But you can't only look at 2110. You have to look at 2110, 2111, and 2112 combined for our AST group. And the reason why we have a shift here, because you see our 2111 supervisor pay went down 63%. We didn't decrease our headcount by 63%. This is the result of changing our object codes on our expense side to match what HR was classifying people as between an A, administrator, and an S, supervisory. So that was an internal classification that our HR group was classifying these specific positions as. And then earlier this year, I think, the board had a directive to explore separating out the A's, S's, and T's. Remember that? So when we were looking at that and saying, well, this has never been an issue before because they were always considered lumped in one group. So the way that HR was classifying somebody versus what the general ledger coding, there's a mismatch on some of these positions. So we re-sunk that up and said, if we have to separate these, let's make all the expense coding match too. So that's where if you combine A's, S's, and T's, which they have been for as long as we've been here, this is what you should be looking at. 15.3, 15.8, 14.8, 14.7. This is the change in AST group. And that looks pretty similar to this, just for comparison to teachers. And here's the detail of how that happens. So I do an audit of what HR classifies as an A, S, or T and see what object they're hitting. So in 24-25, 13 positions were falling under this 2111 that should have been 2110. So those shift over. Under S's, They should all be in 2111. There's one anomaly here under 2110. That should move over. So that's how you get this. And in fact, from 2425 to 2526, we reduced headcount in the AST group by 6. So that's just one example of, you know, you're not working in this all day, every day, and nobody can expect a quick analysis, and we don't expect the committee to be doing line item analysis. That I don't feel that's not the role of the committee. The committee's a little higher level discussion than that.
So
This is our work. Like we do this. We got this part.
yeah, so, but that was one of my questions, was the change in the head count and the supervisor, because I did notice that as well. And, I guess maybe that goes to a broader question of what exactly are the expectations of the committee? Because I know we've gone
Yeah.
over that, but like if we're discussing a referendum, or if we're supposed to give some sort of opinion on it, but we don't have those underlying details, that's kind of what I'm
Sure.
where I'm coming from. And then I also just did want to note that if you do like a ratio off of the salary change versus the headcount change, it is a 3% increase over last year for that AST group.
Yeah.
And so like, I did account for that.
Yep.
I just want to mention, but also from a grander scheme, like I'm not sure how to comment or be part of the discussion other than just listening and then, I don't know, nodding my head without this underlying detail.
Yeah. One, the detail is available to you if you want it. Like I can produce the line items to you through a request to the superintendent's office. I'd be
I would love
glad
that.
to share that. But you're bringing up a much bigger, better question, and we're kind of have the same question. What's the role of this committee? So is it to provide feedback, initial feedback on some administrative recommendations before the board gets it? And I guess I'd defer to the board with us and the chair of the committee is what intent do you see coming out of these meetings? Because that's a very, very good question.
I would like to hear the committee, especially the community members, give feedback on whether or not, how supportive they are about a referendum. And then also looking at timing and things. Are we looking at November? Are we looking at April? The amount, we heard in comments at the last board meeting, one community member said, oh, don't just ask for a little bit, go big. But he didn't really specify, and, you know, it's not sure how many, if the Kenosha community really wants us to go big, or what they're thinking. So you're kind of our touchstone here. That's what we're looking for.
I'm happy to give you some feedback. I don't think you've met the burden. I don't think it would pass today. I don't think so at all.
That is very valuable. Can you explain? Yes.
And my personal feelings aside, I'm not surprised at all knowing the numbers when the schools got cut a couple years ago. I mean, we've got declining enrollment, we've got all these, I mean, this isn't a surprise. So I guess I'm feeling really disappointed that there isn't a better plan, guys. I think that's the feedback you're gonna get. And you've got more time now than you'll have in November. In November, you're up against a really bad situation. I mean, you've got a little reserve, you probably could go a year, maybe 2, but not really. And I think it's time that you guys got really serious and take as many people as volunteer or not, but there needs to be some structural change and some convincing of the public that you've done everything you can do. And I don't think you're there. I just don't.
Laura? Oh, perfect.
So I'm looking through all this, and it, really starts, I think, at a higher level with, Congress and all the legislature, because the formula doesn't work, period. And our community is getting older and older. I mean, you have people, you're asking to pay for the future when they don't have kids in school anymore. And, you know, our enrollment is dropping because we don't have the high birth rates and everything. It's just a formula that doesn't work. But I agree to some extent, it has to be in layman's terms. When I was looking through all this, you know, I had to look here and look there. And, you know, I come from a governmental budget background, so I understand mill rate and, you know, equalized value and all that other stuff. But, you know, the public really doesn't. And they don't understand that, you know, they're going to get charged one way or another if they don't belly up a little bit, you know, because push is going to come to shove, and at some point or another, we're going to have to raise taxes. You know, that's it. So I guess putting it out there in like an easier way, and I don't even know what that way would be, but maybe visually, and really get some powerhouse communicators to like start, you know, advertising, you know, communicating in the newspaper from right now all the way up, you know, pounding it. Because generally speaking, I don't think anybody really does understand, you know, what the whole big picture is, the general community.
If I could respond to that a little bit too, I agree with you, especially seeing some of the online chatter just in the last 2 weeks as people are opening up their assessments in the city and seeing the spike in assessments. I can't even count how many times I've seen just bad information, people thinking that that assessment increase is somehow going to be translated into increased taxes for us. Mm-hmm. Or the fact that people saw 20 to 25% tax increases on their levy from Kenosha Unified School District. And I've seen this 1,000 times. They found a way to get more taxes from us. We failed the referendum, we said no, but they still got more taxes out of us. No, we did not. We did not get any budget increase from that. That was a result of losing over $9 million of general state aid. So this board was forced to levy more. That did not give us one more dollar of spendable dollars.
I get that, and I don't think that's the right question or the right discussion. It's a bigger picture. And that's why I asked you what your plan was, because it's a structural, it's making some really hard choices, and it's.
Can I?
Sure.
I was really kind of, and this is just a question for understanding, please. When you say that not meeting the burden of proof or whatever you were going with that, what would that look like for you?
For me, it would look like folks not moving back to Kenosha because of the school system. And you hear that every day. For me, it would look like understanding what the expenses were for. There's a 2.9 structural okay, fine. You're assuming that the structure stays the same. It's not going to stay the same. Across the country, it's not. And comparing us to Mauston, it doesn't fly. There's 5 school districts in the state that are similar. And that's who we should be comparing to. And I know they're all in trouble. But we've got to, the responsible thing to do, what I would expect as a citizen, is that somebody took a hard structural look at what we've got going and said, we need to X, Y, Z, and we have no other choice. I don't feel like the public thinks you've done that. That's just honest feedback.
Question, so isn't there a certain amount of law that says, you know, you have to have a contract for these teachers and you have to provide so much X, Y, Z? So to some extent, there's nothing you can cut back on, right?
And that 80, yeah, 80.
It's the revenue that is really the problem.
85% of our budget is staff. The other portions of that we get into building maintenance or facilities and materials, but the bulk of our expense we're a people industry. So that I was trying, that's why I wanted to probe that out a little bit more with you, because when we talk about changing structure, there's a lot, as you mentioned, there's a lot of law and a lot of, we have to make sure that we're doing things appropriately. Even, and I'll bring up normally I compare us to the Big Five districts. My concern, and there's been some pretty well publicized, and I'm not looking to throw any of our neighbors under the bus, but when you don't do certain things right in the departments that are here, whether it's maintenance and paint, and what's, lead paint, whether it's getting your books, making sure your reports are done on time to the state and not missing important deadlines, there really are there's some key pieces that I don't know how that would look different and still meet doing what we need to do to make sure we have clean, safe buildings and make sure that our financial reports are done on time and making sure that we follow the law when we, with our hiring practices. So I appreciate what you're saying, and I'd like to talk more about this with you. Please don't take my response as defensive at all, because I'm truly trying to understand what can be done to change that perception, because I thought in my closing 7 schools was the worst thing I've ever done as an administrator. It was the most heart-wrenching, gut punch process that I've ever been through. And my hope was that after doing that, the community would see that we're serious about making sure that we are spending a good steward of public dollars. And beyond that, I guess that was just so incredibly hard that I was hoping that it would gain more credit in the community that we were taking the fiscal responsibilities we have seriously. And there's a fine, anyway, I could keep on babbling on about this, and there's only a few minutes left for the community, but, for the committee, rather.
I mean, I don't know Ryan, but I'm guessing that they too would be just as willing to put in as much time if you were truly interested in our more full engagement. I mean, coming to a meeting for an hour a week isn't, or hour every couple canceled, it doesn't do it. So
And
we can't do it.
we can have
I have everyone's contact information, so I can reach out to community members, and maybe we can set something up, because I would be interested to get your perspective. And this is something, I guess, I just see this as this is critical. It's incredibly critical that we get this right and that we fund our schools appropriately, and I want to make sure we get it right. So I'd be happy to meet with.
So are we providing only the core? I mean, so what the extra classes you do have are funded? You do have money for those. So there's no extra classes or anything. It's all kind of stripped down to the core, what you have to teach, right?
There are some things that, when we start talking about what those other pieces are, those are kind of, now we're getting into the things that make school.
Okay.
We're talking, we did have a very, I'll bring up this option we talked about a couple of years ago when we were closing Ruther. That there are some community sacred cows, I would say, some things that really make Kenosha special, that if you are definitely third rails of closures. Community spoke loud and clear that that was not what they wanted to see happen. And I imagine if we talked about theater, I imagine if we talked about sports, any fine arts, we'd hear the same. But those things come at a cost that isn't necessarily funded fully by a state funding formula. So how do we communicate that? And how
Well,
do
they're
we?
all going
I
to have
think you
to,
just have to do it. And,
Yeah.
and I think you have to break them up into categories and separate it, because we have this, we have sports, we have music, we have theater, we have all these additional things, and they could be on the chopping block. We can't let that happen in our community. I think people know our community well, and to your point, thank you for bringing that up, and that thank you for breaking that down for everybody, because we live in a time of craziness on the internet and stories and things that aren't true. So we have to work even harder than, when was our last major, when was the last time we ran a big referendum for, was that,
Yeah,
Which
you're
school
talking
was
about the stadiums, like the Bradford
Yeah.
Stadium, so.
Right. and we got those through. and-
Finished, yeah,
But so,
been a
you know,
while.
we really, and we're going to have some way of getting this type of information to the person that can check and send it out and say, this isn't fact or fiction, you know? We got a lot of fiction out there. And we have to really communicate with every community. And you can be an older person. I mean, I'm older at this point. I'm going to need somebody to help care for me at some age, you know, in my lifetime. And it's so important. And pay me now or pay me later. And we want our kids to have these really great opportunities. And it just means that the team has to say, no, we're not going to accept that. We're going to pass this, and we're going to bring all the people in that helped us keep our music and our arts programs and the people that are passionate about that, because that's the only way we're going to get it done. And of course, I don't know what's on the agenda on those 2 dates that we're looking at, but I think that's really critical in getting the turnout. It's going to be a major campaign.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that the next time we meet is June 11th. And I'm hearing that committee members might be interested in meeting before that, as sort of like an ad hoc. So if that is of interest, Dr. Weiss, how do we do that?
Or at least like having the underlying detail, because I did want to, I know I had two pieces that may have seemed critical, but I do want to commend the group that, you know, if you look back to COVID time, you saw a lot of increases in expenses, and then through the next couple of years, you saw subsequent decreases back down to even pre-COVID levels. So it's not like these efforts that they're discussing are not happening. And you can see where, like, I found two line items, granted in a generalized view, but there are a lot of other decreases that are happening that you can see in the numbers.
So Dr. Weiss will reach out to individual members to see if we want to have some sort of ad hoc meeting before, sort of a strictly referendum meeting, a listening session or something like that. Otherwise, we are actually adjourned because we got to go to our next meeting. Thank you so much, everybody.
We do have a plus delta form coming around. If we could get some feedback from the group, that'd be terrific.